Rain hit the cedar deck like fists. I opened the door, cold air rushing in. 2 officers stood under the porch light. Their eyes heavy, their voices steady. "Mrs. Donovan, we regret to inform you. Your husband, Michael, was killed in a car crash an hour ago." My ears rang, my throat locked. Upstairs, a lamp still glowed through the crack of our bedroom door. Michael had just kissed me goodnight. I whispered, "That's impossible." The taller officer shifted his weight, rain dripping from his hat. "We found his wallet, wedding ring, ID. The vehicle was destroyed." "Fatal, ma'am." I shook my head. "He's here, sleeping." The words left me before I could breathe. I turned, pointing toward the stairs. "CTA, stay with me. If betrayal ever hit your front door, would you face it, or turn away? Tell me below." I led them through the hall. Boots squeaked against the hardwood. The furnace kicked on, blowing dry heat across my face. I gripped the banister so hard my knuckles burned. Each step up the staircase felt heavier than the last. My chest ached. My daughter Nora's door stood closed, her posters glowing under the crack. She was 16. Innocent. She still believed the world made sense. At the top, the hallway smelled faintly of cedar and musk. His cologne. I pushed open our bedroom door. Inside, under the quilt my mother had sewn, a man slept soundly. The lamp glowed. A book lay open on the nightstand. His chest rose, steady, calm. The scar above his eyebrow caught the light. I gasped. Same scar. Same broad shoulders. The man I had married. The officer's hand moved toward his holster. He studied the figure in the bed. "That's him," I whispered. But in my ears, doubt scratched like nails. The officer held out a photo. A body burned, twisted inside wreckage. My husband's watch glinted under melted steel. I pressed a hand to my mouth. The copper taste of fear spread across my tongue. "Who is this?" I whispered. My knees buckled against the dresser. The officer's eyes narrowed. "That's what we need to know, ma'am." A flash of memory. Michael laughing at Thanksgiving, carving turkey, grease shining on his fingers. The same man, or someone who wore his face. I touched the quilt. It was warm, smelled faintly of dryer sheets. He stirred, just slightly. A breath escaped his lips. "Michael," I whispered. No answer. Only the furnace humming, steady, cruel. I turned to the officers. "Do you see him?" Their silence was sharper than any words. My throat burned. What do I do? Outside, sirens wailed faintly through the rain. In here, my life cracked open. 2 versions of my husband. One burned on the highway. One breathing in my bed. If this was your night, your marriage, your house, would you shake him awake, demand the truth? Or would you run, protect your child, and leave the bed cold? Choose. Tell me. Because my story has only begun. I thought about the clinic where I worked long hours. Billing sheets, fluorescent lights, the hum of printers. I came home exhausted, but the house was quiet. Michael was often gone. I told myself his absences were investments in our future. But when Nora asked, "Why is Dad never here?" I swallowed the answer. I said he was building something important. The truth. I was the one building. Holding the house together with late night meals and unpaid overtime, keeping bills from drowning us. I remembered our 15th anniversary. I booked a dinner downtown, candles, white tablecloth. He arrived an hour late, smelling faintly of whiskey and stranger's perfume. He said, "I'm sorry, honey. Work emergency." I nodded, cut into cold steak, and pretended. The pretending became routine. I became background to his ambition. Neighbors saw the successful husband. They didn't see the wife staring at empty chairs. I remembered sitting in Nora's school gym. Rows of parents cheered during her debate. I clapped until my palms stung. Michael's seat beside me stayed empty. Afterward, she asked if he even cared. I told her yes. I told her love sometimes hides behind duty. One night, after another fight about his phone buzzing past midnight, I stood at the sink. The dishwasher hummed, water steaming my face. I thought, maybe this is what marriage is. One person waiting, the other always leaving. I tried to fight the loneliness with tradition. Sunday dinners, family photos, Christmas cards mailed on time. But even in pictures, the distance showed. His smile stiff, my eyes tired. Nora leaning closer to me, not him. I remembered dusting the old mantel photo again. The bride in that frame still believed she mattered. The woman holding the rag in her 40s wasn't so sure. And now, after police knocked with their impossible news, I couldn't escape it anymore. The cracks weren't new. They had been there all along, hairline fractures spreading under the weight of silence. Rain eased outside. The house smelled of damp wood and lemon cleaner. I pressed my palm flat against the windowpane. The glass was cold. I whispered to myself, what else have I refused to see? The answer waited upstairs, breathing quietly under my quilt. The morning after the police left, the house felt wrong. Rain had stopped, but dampness clung to the walls. I moved through each room like a stranger in my own home. The living room smelled of cold coffee. An empty mug sat where Michael usually dropped his papers. But his briefcase wasn't there. His coat wasn't on the hook. I walked upstairs, heart hammering. The floor creaked beneath my slippers. In the closet, cedar hung in the air. I pulled his jacket forward, fingers brushing the inner pocket. There it was. A wallet I didn't recognize. Brown leather, stiff, newer than his usual scuffed one. Inside, a driver's license with his photo. But the name wasn't Michael Donovan. It read Matthew Keene. My chest tightened. I flipped through the rest. Credit cards, a folded receipt from an Illinois gas station, dated last week. He hadn't told me he'd gone anywhere near Illinois. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the wallet. The quilt was still warm from where he'd slept. The smell of his cologne drifted from the pillow. Every detail screamed familiar, yet the evidence in my hand said otherwise. I reached for his phone on the nightstand. Locked. But the screen flashed missed calls, an area code I didn't know. 3 digits at the start. Rockford, Illinois. I set it down quickly, as if it might burn me. My reflection stared back from the dark screen. I hardly recognized the woman trembling there. Downstairs, the dishwasher hummed its cycle. The ordinary sound clashed against the storm unraveling inside me. My fingers shook as I opened the kitchen drawer. Bills. Grocery receipts. And one envelope tucked too far back. The return address wasn't ours. Inside, a bank statement addressed to Matthew Keene. Balances I didn't understand. Numbers too large to ignore. I dropped the papers on the counter. They scattered across the tile, ink smudging where my damp hands touched. One line burned into me's, savings withdrawal. 15,000. Bus I braced myself against the counter. The tile felt icy through my palms. The truth was no longer hiding, it was leaking from every corner of my house. Upstairs, footsteps stirred. The man in my bed was waking. And I had proof he wasn't who he claimed to be. I shoved the wallet back into the closet, heart pounding so hard it shook my ribs. I couldn't confront him yet, not without knowing more. Downstairs, the kitchen smelled of lemon cleaner from last night. Sunlight pushed through gray clouds, turning the tile a dull silver. I gathered the scattered bank papers, folded them tight, and slipped them into my robe pocket. The furnace kicked on. Warm air rattled through the vents, but my body stayed cold. Every sound in the house felt louder now. The scrape of a chair, the groan of the stairs. He was awake. I poured myself coffee, hand unsteady, listening. His footsteps moved above me, steady, practiced. The sound of a man who belonged. But did he? I sipped bitter coffee and pulled out my phone. I scrolled past Nora's texts until I reached Aaron's number. My thumb hovered. What if I was wrong? What if grief and fear were twisting me? I pressed call anyway. Her voice came groggy. "Claire, it's early," I whispered. "I need to ask you something. Did Michael ever seem different to you?" There was a pause. She lowered her voice. "Different how?" I swallowed. "Phone calls, trips, names that didn't fit." Her sigh crackled over the line. "I never wanted to stir trouble. But years ago, around Thanksgiving, I answered the house phone when you were in the kitchen. The man on the other end asked for Matthew. My knees weakened. Matthew? Yes." He sounded urgent. When I told him he had the wrong number, he hung up fast. Michael brushed it off, said people confuse numbers all the time. I pressed my forehead to the cabinet, the wood cool under my skin. "Why didn't you tell me?" Hi, her voice broke. "Because you looked happy, Claire. And I thought maybe I imagined it." He made me doubt myself. The heat from the mug burned my palm, but I held on. The name Matthew echoed against every memory, rewriting them. The necklace that felt too heavy. The trips unexplained. The seat left empty at Nora's school. I found a wallet. I whispered. The silence on her end told me she understood more than I wanted. "Claire, you need to be careful." I closed my eyes. Above, the floor creaked again. The man I called husband was moving through my house, humming a tune Michael used to hum when grilling burgers in the summer. And yet, it didn't comfort me now. It chilled me. I waited until he left for work. The front door shut, keys jingling, engine fading down the street. Silence draped the house. I moved quickly. Every minute felt stolen. I pulled open the desk drawers in his study. Paper clips, pens, old tax files. And then, shoved beneath a stack of blank envelopes, a folder stamped in red. Inside were bank slips. Transfers under the name Matthew Keene. Some dated years back, amounts climbing higher each year. Tens of thousands, all shifted quietly. I whispered to myself, how did I never see this? The furnace clicked again, a low hum filling the silence. I closed the folder, slid it under my sweater, and carried it upstairs. In our bedroom, the air smelled faintly of his cologne. I knelt beside the dresser, hands trembling, and opened the bottom drawer. A shoebox sat pushed to the back. Inside, receipts from motels across Illinois, all in his handwriting. One had a date just weeks ago, signed M. Keene. I traced the ink with my fingertip, the letters rough against the thin paper. A photo slipped free. Two boys identical, maybe 10 years old, standing in a yard. Same eyes, same smile. My stomach dropped. Twins. No caption, no year, just proof. I pressed the photo to my chest. My breath ragged. Had he been lying to me from the very beginning? Had I been living with Matthew, not Michael? The dishwasher cycle beeped downstairs, startling me. Ordinary sound, extraordinary terror. I stuffed the photo and receipts into my robe pocket, then pressed the drawer shut with both hands. I thought of Nora. Her laughter at 16. Her faith in her father, however distant he'd been. If she knew the truth, it would splinter her world. I had to protect her, even if it meant carrying this alone for now. I sat on the edge of the bed, folder in my lap, sunlight glinting off the quilt stitches. My reflection in the mirror looked like a stranger. Eyes wide, hair damp from sweat, mouth trembling with words I couldn't say out loud. Down the street, his car was already gone. But in this house, evidence screamed louder than absence. Wallet, bank slips, receipts, and the photo that proved more than I could bear. I whispered to the empty room, "Who are you?" The question stayed, sharp as broken glass, with no answer but the one I already feared. By late afternoon, clouds pressed low over Madison. the windows fogged with the damp air. I moved through the house as if the walls were strangers. Every photo frame on the mantel mocked me. The wedding picture, edges curled, glass flecked with dust. I stared at his smile frozen in that image, wondering whose smile it really was. Nora's music drifted from upstairs. A pop song, muffled, steady, grounding her in a world still simple. I envied her. 16 and unaware that the foundation beneath her family had cracked wide open. I set a pot of stew on the stove. Carrots, potatoes, broth. The smell filled the kitchen, warm, familiar. But it couldn't cover the bitterness in my throat. The door opened. He stepped in, coat dripping with rain. He kissed my cheek casual, as if he hadn't torn my world apart. "I'm starving," he said, dropping his keys on the counter. I forced a nod. My lips trembled against silence. While he changed, I leaned against the counter, my hands pressed flat against the cool laminate, grounding me. The folder of bank slips lay hidden upstairs. The shoebox with receipts burned in my memory. The photo of 2 identical boys haunted every blink. When he came back down, his hair damp, he poured himself a glass of water. The tap hissed. He drank, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and smiled. "So, how was your day?" I stared at him. Every detail was right. The scar above his eyebrow, the tilt of his smile. But everything felt wrong. "I managed," I said softly. The words were brittle, fragile as glass. He reached for the pot, lifted the lid, and inhaled. "Smells good." The steam rose between us, curling like smoke, blinding me with memories. Michael laughing at Thanksgiving. Michael holding Nora in the hospital. Michael, or Matthew. I gripped the wooden spoon so tightly my knuckles ached. The urge to scream the truth pressed against my teeth. But Nora's laughter floated from upstairs, light, innocent. I swallowed the scream. Dinner passed in uneasy silence. Spoons clinked against bowls, broth steaming into the air. He hummed softly, the same tune he always hummed when eating stew. And yet, I no longer trusted even the sound of his voice. Afterward, when Nora retreated to her room, he sat in the living room chair, flipping channels. I stood in the doorway, arms folded. The lamp cast his face in amber light. I searched for my husband and saw only a shadow. The thought struck hard, sharp as broken glass. I was living with a stranger, and the stranger wore my husband's skin. The television flickered, washing the room in shifting colors. He sat slouched, remote in hand, eyes half-lidded. The sound of a game show filled the silence. Applause, laughter, a crowd that didn't belong in my living room. I crossed my arms tighter. "You ever think about family?" I asked. He glanced at me, brow furrowed. "Of course." "Why?" The words caught in my throat. I wanted to ask if Matthew thought of family the same way Michael once had. Instead, I said, "You missed Nora's debate last month." He shrugged. "Work got in the way. You know how it is. Casual. Too casual. As if missing our daughter's milestone was no different than forgetting to buy milk." I sank onto the sofa, cushions sagging under my weight. The lamp buzzed faintly, its bulb old, its light dim. I stared at him. Every line of his face was familiar, and yet the warmth behind it was gone. Memory pressed in. Our wedding day. I had stood under white lights, bouquet trembling in my hands. He'd whispered, "Forever, Claire." That vow had carried me through storms. But now, looking at him, I wondered if those words had belonged to someone else. The furnace rumbled, pushing warm air through the vents. Still, a chill settled over my arms, raising goosebumps. "You've been different," I said finally. His eyes flicked up from the screen. "Different how?" I gripped the edge of the cushion, nails biting fabric. "Trips you never explain. Calls late at night. Things that don't add up." His jaw tightened, only for a second. Then the smile returned, thin, controlled. You're overthinking. Stress does that. The answer cut deeper than a denial. Dismissal. He wasn't fighting to reassure me. He was erasing me. The applause from the television swelled, laugh tracks ringing hollow. I pressed my palms to my knees, grounding myself against the spinning room. He turned back to the screen, as if the conversation had never happened. I studied the man beside me. The scar above his eyebrow. The shape of his hands, veins rising under the skin. So much the same. And yet, every detail now felt like a costume worn too well. Nora's footsteps creaked on the stairs. She called out, "Good night, Mom." "Good night, Dad." My throat tightened. I forced cheer into my reply, "Good night, sweetheart." The word Dad hung in the air, like a lie neither of us corrected. I looked at him, waiting for recognition, guilt, anything. He just nodded, eyes never leaving the glowing screen. That was the moment I felt it. The sharp, undeniable fracture between the man I'd loved and the stranger sitting before me. The stew still lingered on the counter, gone cold, fat congealed on the surface. The smell clung to the air, heavy, unwanted. I couldn't hold it any longer. I rose from the sofa, heart slamming against my ribs. "Stop pretending," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. He lowered the remote slowly. "Pretending." His eyes narrowed, cautious. I stepped closer, the lamp stretching my shadow across the wall. "I found your wallet. Not Michael Donovan's. Matthew Keene's." His jaw flexed. A flicker of something dark flashed across his face, then vanished. "You've been snooping," he said evenly, almost calm. Too calm. "Don't twist this." My hands shook at my sides. "You lied to me. To Nora. To everyone." He rose from the chair, taller, heavier, his frame blotting out the light. Rain tapped against the window, soft but insistent, like a warning. "You're imagining things," he snapped. "Stress. Grief. You're not yourself." I laughed, bitter, hollow. "Don't you dare blame this on me. Receipts, bank accounts, photos. I've seen enough." He took a step closer. The floor creaked under his weight. "You don't know what you think you know." His breath smelled of stew and steel. Tears burned my eyes, but I refused to blink them away. "Then tell me. Are you Michael? Or have I been living with a stranger for 23 years? For a second, silence filled the room. Only the hum of the furnace and the patter of rain kept time. His mouth opened, then closed again. Finally, he muttered, "Some questions shouldn't be asked." The words cut deeper than any confession. Not denial. Not truth. Just a wall shutting me out. I staggered back, the quilt on the sofa brushing my fingertips. My chest ached with betrayal, the kind that hollowed you from the inside out. Upstairs, Nora's door clicked shut. The sound pierced me like glass. She believed she said goodnight to her father, but I didn't know who that man was anymore. I pressed a hand to my stomach, steadying myself. My voice cracked, but I forced it out. "This isn't over. Not for me. Not for her." His eyes darkened, unreadable. The lamp buzzed, shadows shifting across his face, making him a stranger all over again. The rain outside thickened, drumming harder against the glass. Inside, silence swallowed us whole, and I stood there, ripped between two choices. Keep silent, protecting my daughter's fragile world, or tear the mask away and risk losing everything. The next morning, the rain eased into a gray drizzle. Nora left early for school, her backpack bumping against the doorframe. I kissed her cheek, holding on longer than usual. She pulled away with a laugh. "Mom, I'll be fine." When the house was quiet again, I called Erin. "Come over," I whispered. Her voice tightened. "Did something happen?" "Just come, please." No, she arrived an hour later, hair damp from the mist. In her hands, a worn cardboard box, edges soft with age. I should have given you this years ago, she said. It was in Mom's attic. I didn't know what to make of it. We sat at the kitchen table. The box smelled of dust and cedar, like old trunks forgotten in basements. I opened the flaps, my fingers trembling. On top lay Polaroids, faded to sepia. Two boys, side by side, identical down to the curve of their smiles. Both with the same scar above the eyebrow. My stomach lurched. That's Michael, I whispered. And that's Matthew, Aaron finished softly. His twin. They were separated when they were kids. Matthew stayed with Dad's brother for a while, then disappeared. Michael never talked about it. I shuffled through more photos. Birthdays with 2 cakes. School pictures with the same striped shirt, worn by both boys. The attic smell rose stronger, a wave of mildew and memory. Beneath the photos was a folded document. The paper had yellowed, edges brittle. Erin's hands shook as she spread it open. Certificate of live birth. The header read, Twin births, Michael Donovan and Matthew Donovan. My chest hollowed. All the strange slips of tongue, the wallet with Matthew's name, the motel receipts. They weren't pieces of paranoia. They were pieces of truth. He was always jealous, Erin murmured. Matthew wanted what Michael had. The stability. The recognition. I think he came back. Claire. I gripped the edge of the table, wood pressing into my palms. My mind replayed every kiss, goodnight, every whispered vow. Had they belonged to Matthew all along? Or had Michael been replaced later, quietly, so seamlessly I never noticed? Outside, rainwater dripped from the gutter, tapping against the porch steps in a steady rhythm. Each drop sounded like a countdown, marking the collapse of the life I thought I knew. I stared at the birth certificate. The ink faded but the truth undeniable. The man sleeping in my bed, the man eating stew at my table. He might not be my husband. He might be Matthew, wearing Michael's life like a borrowed suit. My breath caught. I don't know who I married anymore. I whispered. The words tasted of rust and fear. Erin reached across the table, her hand trembling against mine. We'll figure this out. Together. But Claire, you need to be careful. If he's been hiding this long, he won't let it go easily. The Polaroid photos stared up at me. 2 boys frozen in time. One alive, one dead, and I was trapped between them. The kitchen light buzzed overhead, humming against the rain, tapping the windows. I pressed the birth certificate flat on the table, as if more pressure could change the ink. Michael Donovan. Matthew Donovan. Twins recorded on the same day, the same hospital. I swallowed hard. Why didn't he ever tell me? My voice cracked, splintering like old wood. Erin shook her head slowly. Michael never wanted to talk about Matthew. Said it was easier pretending he was gone. I always thought it was shame. But maybe it was fear. I traced the faded signatures at the bottom of the certificate. The paper felt brittle, cold against my fingertips. I saw the accident photos. I whispered. Police said Michael died. His wallet, his ring. But I have him sleeping in my house. Erin's eyes filled with dread. What if the man in that wreck was the real Michael? The words pierced me like ice sliding down my spine. I gripped the edge of the table until my nails dug crescents into the wood. If the wreck claimed Michael, then the man in my bed was not my husband. He was Matthew. Memories reeled through me in fragments. His late arrivals. The heavy necklace I never could wear without shivering. The perfume I couldn't name. Every detail, once dismissed, now twisted into evidence. Erin's hand brushed my wrist, grounding me. Claire, listen to me. You need to protect yourself. If Matthew took Michael's place, if he's been living as him, then he's capable of anything. The stew pot, on the stove hissed as the last of its heat faded. The smell turned sour in my nose. I pushed back from the table, heart hammering. 23 years. A marriage built on vows, laughter, pain, sacrifice. But if they belonged to Matthew, every kiss, every promise, then my life had been a stage play, my role scripted by a stranger. I forced myself to stand. The linoleum felt cold beneath my bare feet. I paced to the sink, staring out at the gray yard blurred by rain. The maple tree swayed, branches scratching the siding. The house itself seemed to lean under the weight of the truth. Behind me, Aaron's voice shook. I remember one summer, before you and Michael married. Matthew came to town. He looked identical, but his eyes, harder, sharper. He told me once, "Michael gets everything." I thought he was jealous. Now I'm not so sure. Now my reflection in the dark window pane looked foreign. Hollow eyes, lips pressed thin, a woman undone. I pressed a hand to the glass, cold seeping into my palm. Outside, the rain quickened. 1,000 tiny fists against the pane. Aaron whispered, "If he knows you've discovered this, he won't stay calm." Oh, I turned back, throat raw. I need to know the truth. I need to look him in the eyes and ask. The lamp flickered, shadows shifting across the kitchen walls, making everything look strange. The house no longer felt safe. It felt like a stage set built on lies. Aaron reached for my hand, but I pulled away. The decision was already forming. I had to confront him, but I didn't know if I'd be facing my husband or the ghost of his brother. Upstairs, the floor creaked. His footsteps moved across the hall. And the sound struck me like a verdict. The man under my roof was not Michael. 3 days later, Madison lay under its first blanket of snow. White rooftops. Quiet streets. The world looked peaceful. Inside me, nothing was. I stood at the kitchen sink, hands raw from hot water. The smell of dish soap clung to my skin. Nora's laughter used to fill this space. Now she barely spoke at breakfast. At the clinic, whispers followed me like shadows. "Did you hear? Michael Donovan died in that crash." Then softer, "But Claire swears he's still at home." I felt eyes at my back with every step. I smiled. Stapled insurance claims, answered phones. Pretended the gossip didn't cut. But when I passed the break room, silence dropped like a curtain. I caught fragments. Delusional, poor thing, can't accept it. My chest tightened until I could barely breathe. That night, Nora sat at the table, pushing peas across her plate. "Mom," she whispered, "did you cry today?" I swallowed hard. "Not today, sweetie." Her eyes lingered on me, searching for cracks. I forced a smile. She went back to her homework. After she climbed upstairs, I sat alone in the dim dining room. The overhead light flickered. Shadows stretched long across the wooden floor. The stew pot still waited in the sink, greasy water cold against my wrist. I pulled the hidden folder from beneath the cushion. Pages of statements, each line darker than the last. Transfers, withdrawals, the name Matthew Keene scrawled again and again. The paper smelled faintly of ink and old dust. I whispered into the silence, "This isn't grief. This is betrayal." The words steadied me. But then came the knock. A neighbor stood on the porch, breath clouding in the cold. "Claire, I'm so sorry about Michael. He was a good man." I nodded, throat dry. Behind me, the man, Matthew, appeared in the doorway, his hand resting on Nora's shoulder. She leaned into him, believing in a father who wasn't hers. The neighbor's eyes softened. "You're lucky to have family around you. Not everyone does." Lucky. The word rang hollow, like a bell cracked down the middle. When the door closed, I sank against it, the wood icy against my back. Erased in my own life. Doubted by friends. Chained to a stranger. But one truth held me upright. I would not let him take Nora's future. I would not let this lie become her legacy. I whispered, "I'll find a way." The snow kept falling outside, muffling the night. Inside, my resolve began to sharpen, hard and cold as the winter air. The cafe smelled of fresh beans and wet coats. Snowmelt dripped from boots, pooling on the tile. I pulled my scarf tighter, sliding into a corner booth. Detective Cheryl Collins sat across from me. Her gray coat still damp. Lines framed her eyes, wariness carved deep, but her gaze was sharp, steady, impossible to hide from. "You sounded urgent," she said quietly. I slid the folder across the table. Her gloved fingers tapped it once. Then she opened it. Bank statements. Receipts. The yellowed birth certificate with 2 names. Michael Donovan, Matthew Donovan. Her eyes flicked up at me. "Where did you get this?" she asked. Erin had the box. "I found the rest in his drawer. In a shoebox." My voice cracked. "I don't know who I married." Steam from my mug fogged my glasses. I pulled them off, wiped with a napkin, hands trembling. Cheryl flipped another page. Her brows knit tighter. "These social security numbers, they're off. 1 digit swapped, but consistent. That's not a mistake. That's a design." I felt my stomach drop. "So I'm not crazy." She studied me. "No. But Claire, if this is true, you're living with someone who built a false life for decades. That takes planning. Connections. Nerves of steel." I looked down at the tabletop, scratched with initials from years of couples before us. My reflection stared back in the glossy surface. "You believe me?" I whispered. She sipped her coffee, the spoon clinking soft. "I believe there's enough smoke to look for fire." Quietly, "If you want me involved, we do this off the books." "No one else?" "Not yet." I nodded. Relief mixed with dread, sharp and bitter. Because her words meant danger was real. And now, my silence was no longer safety. It was complicity. A gust of wind rattled the cafe windows. Snow swirled in silver spirals outside. I pulled the folder back, tucked it under my coat. Cheryl's hand stopped me gently. "Keep it hidden. And Claire, watch him closely. Don't let him see you watching." I rose, scarf brushing against my cheek. The air near the door was sharp, stinging my lungs. When I stepped outside, the snow crunched under my boots. Each step felt like a vow. For 23 years, I'd been blind. Now my eyes were open. "And once you see the truth, you can't unsee it." I whispered into the night. "This is war." Quiet, but war. Through the wind swallowed my words, carrying them into the dark. Snow clung to my coat as I stepped back inside. The warmth of the furnace brushed my face, but my body still shook. I dropped my scarf on the chair. The fabric smelled faintly of roasted beans and cold air. He was already in the kitchen. Sleeves rolled, hands steady as he wiped the counter. He looked up and smiled. "You're home early." I forced my lips to match his. "Clinic cut me loose sooner." My voice wavered, but I kept stirring the stew like nothing had changed. Nora came bouncing down the stairs. Her laughter filled the hall, bright against the storm outside. She wrapped her arms around him first. "Dad, can you check my homework later?" He ruffled her hair. "Of course, kiddo." She leaned into him, trusting. I pressed the wooden spoon harder against the pot until broth splashed. After dinner, I watched him move around the living room. He adjusted the blinds. The lamp glowed amber against his face. Every movement practiced, precise. Not the clumsy man who once tripped on wrapping paper at Christmas. I sat quietly, studying. The sound of his keys hitting the bowl by the door. The faint clang. Different this time, sharper, metallic. A new note beneath the familiar cedar. He caught my stare. "What?" he asked, remote balanced in his hand. "Nothing," I whispered, folding a napkin until it tore. My fingers shook, the paper softening under sweat. Upstairs, Nora sang softly, her voice breaking on a high note. I thought of Cheryl's warning, watch him closely. Don't let him know you know. In each step he took, each hum under his breath, I recorded in my mind. Later, when he finally drifted to bed, I sat alone by the window. The snow outside glowed under the street lamp. The wind whistled through a crack in the frame. I pressed the hidden folder tighter against my chest. My life had shrunk to silence and secrets. Friends whispered. Neighbors offered pitying looks, and inside my own house I was a ghost. But ghosts can still fight. Not with screams. Not with fists. With truth. With patience. I whispered into the cold glass, for Nora. For me. For everything I built. The words steadied me, heavy but unbreakable. Tomorrow, I would meet Cheryl again. This time, I wouldn't just bring papers. I'd bring resolve. And maybe, finally, a plan. If you were me, carrying this secret alone, would you confront the stranger at once? Or stay silent until justice is certain? Tell me where your heart leans. The bell above the cafe door chimed. Snow swirled in behind her, clinging to the glass. Detective Cheryl waved me over, her gray coat drying slowly against the radiator. Beside her sat another woman. Dark blazer, hair tied back, glasses sliding down her nose. She extended a hand, firm but warm. Paula Green. Cheryl thought you might need me. We ordered coffee and waffles. The smell of butter and sugar drifted across the small booth. I wrapped my fingers around the mug, letting the heat fight the winter chill. Paula opened her laptop, screen glowing pale blue. Cheryl showed me the bank statements. These transfers. They're deliberate. Someone built a shadow identity. Not sloppy. Calculated. I slid the envelope closer. Receipts, folded in half, ink smudged with age. Rockford, Illinois. He said he never went there. Paula scanned the slips quickly, lips pressed thin. These matched transactions I traced from an account under Matthew Keene. Same dates. Same numbers. He's laundering money. My throat went dry. Cheryl leaned in, voice low. If we go official now, the story explodes. Press, neighbors, Nora. Do you want that yet? I shook my head, eyes burning. I can't destroy her world. Not before I know everything. She still needs her father, whoever he is. Paula closed her laptop. Then we build quietly. We find where the money ends up. Safety deposit boxes, offshore accounts. We gather proof he can't deny. Her certainty steadied me. For months, I'd carried suspicion alone. Now, across a table sticky with spilled syrup, I had allies. Real ones. A child's laughter echoed from another booth. The sound made my chest ache. Nora's laughter used to fill our house like this. Now it was muffled, careful. Cheryl tapped the birth certificate on the table. This is the key, twins. That explains the duplicate identity. But we need more. We need a thread to pull that unravels his entire web. I looked at the snow sliding down the window pane. The world outside was white, pure. Inside, my truth was ink, stained and heavy. I whispered, I'll do whatever it takes. Paula studied me for a long moment. Then be ready. He'll sense you watching. He'll test you. And you can't flinch. I nodded. The fork in my hand scraped against the plate, a sound sharp as glass. For the first time, my fear shifted. Not just of losing him, but of what I might discover when I finally looked him in the eye. Snow fell harder outside, blotting out the streetlights. The cafe grew dim, golden light catching in Paula's glasses. I felt the weight of the folder in my bag. Heavier than the necklace. Heavier than every silence I'd swallowed. And I knew. The first trap had to be mine. But would I have the courage to set it? That night I sat at the dining table, laptop open. Snow still fell outside, soft against the dark street. The lamp hummed low, casting a circle of yellow light. I slid the bank statements across the screen. Each number felt like a whisper of betrayal. Transfers. Withdrawals. Cayman accounts I never knew existed. Paula had texted Mia, track everything. Time, place, names. Don't confront yet. So I kept a notebook tucked under the bills. Cheap spiral spine. Pages smelling faintly of ink and coffee. At 10, he came downstairs, phone in hand. I watched him from the kitchen doorway. He stepped onto the porch, coat collar raised. Through the window, I saw his breath cloud in the frozen air. The garage door groaned open. Car engine started. Then silence. He was gone. I flipped the notebook open, scribbling the time. My hand cramped around the pen. Ink smeared across my finger, dark and stubborn. Upstairs, Nora's desk lamp burned late. The faint scratch of her pencil drifted down the stairs. She was studying for a history test, oblivious to the truth unraveling beneath her feet. I moved to his study. The printer still warm. A single sheet sat in the tray. Insurance beneficiary change request, unsigned. My name crossed out. Nora's left blank. My chest squeezed tight. So he hadn't just stolen Michael's name. He was rewriting the future, too. I folded the paper, slid it into the folder. The scent of toner clung to my palms. I wiped them on my jeans, but the feeling stuck. A floorboard creaked. I froze. The door clicked open, and he stepped in. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, voice calm. His hair was mussed, jacket still damp with snow. "I was just finishing paperwork," I said. The lie tasted metallic. He smiled faintly, set the keys in the bowl. "I'll be in bed." When he left, I let the breath escape. The silence pressed harder than the storm outside. Each page in my folder felt like a brick. A wall I was building quietly, stone by stone. I whispered, "Soon." The word fogged the cold glass. I imagined standing in a courtroom. Paula presenting the accounts. Cheryl holding up the birth certificate. The world finally seeing the truth. But then a darker thought struck. What if he already suspected me? What if he was setting a trap of his own? The furnace rattled. The house groaned. Shadows shifted across the ceiling like restless ghosts. I closed the folder, clutching it to my chest. Every secret was weight, every silence a chain, and soon one of us would break. The key was small brass, taped beneath the drawer. I held it in my palm, its teeth biting my skin. Cold. Heavy. Cheryl's voice echoed in my mind. "Follow the paper trail. Safety deposit boxes don't lie." 2 days later, Paula met me outside the local bank. Snow flurries spun through the air, catching in her dark hair. She slipped her gloves off, pressing a folder against her chest. "We tracked the transfers. They end here." Inside, the lobby smelled of paper and stale coffee. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. I kept my scarf pulled high, heart racing. The clerk led us into a narrow hallway. Metal doors lined both sides, each with a number. When I slid the key into the lock, the click echoed like a gunshot. The box was heavy. Inside lay another wallet, nearly identical to the first. A gold ring rested on velvet, engraving one letter off. M. Donovan versus M. Donovan. Close enough to fool anyone. There were also passports. 2. Both with his face. One said Michael Donovan. The other, Matthew Keene. My breath hitched. I touched the laminated page, the paper cool under my fingertips. The man who tucked Nora in at night had built his own legend. Paula whispered. "This is enough to raise alarms, but not enough to convict." Cheryl's eyes narrowed. "We need to catch him moving money. In real time." I nodded, throat tight. I imagined Nora's face when she discovered her father was a lie. No. I couldn't let that happen. That evening, back home, I watched him pace the living room. He checked his phone, smiled faintly at messages I couldn't read. The lamplight cast long shadows across his face, hardening every feature. He slipped the phone into his jacket, grabbed the keys. The door closed with a solid thud. Through the window I saw taillights vanish into the snow. I opened my notebook. My pen scratched across paper, ink pooling dark, receipts, wallets, birth certificate, passports. Duplicate ring. Each line was a nail sealing the coffin of his lies, but every word I wrote tightened the knot in my chest. Was I building justice for Nora? Or burying myself deeper in silence? Upstairs, Nora's lamp went out. The house sank into darkness. Only the furnace hummed, low and steady. I whispered, "The next step is mine." The words felt like a vow. But a single question clawed at me. When the time comes, do I reveal him to the world? Or keep playing wife to a stranger until I'm ready? What would you choose? Expose the lie now, or stay silent and wait for justice? The church bells tolled, low and mournful. I stood at the end of the pew, black gloves tight around my fingers. The scent of old wood filled the sanctuary. People filled the rows with whispered condolences. Such a tragedy. Michael was a good man. I nodded, lips pressed thin. Inside, my stomach churned with secrets I could never speak. Nora sat beside me, clutching my hand. Her palm was damp, trembling. Her eyes shone red. She still believed her father lay in that coffin. I tightened my grip, steadying her and myself. Candles flickered along the altar. The smoke curled like ghosts rising. When the pastor called Michael's name, my chest hollowed. Because the man beside me each night wasn't the man in that casket. After the service, neighbors hugged me. Perfume, wool coats, the smell of peppermint gum. Each word of comfort felt like a blade. "He loved you so much, Claire." I forced a nod even as my heart screamed. Later that evening, Cheryl called. Her voice came sharp, urgent. "He's moving money, Claire. Real transfers this time. We have agents watching the accounts." I pressed the phone tighter to my ear, snow melting down my boots. "Will they believe you?" "They'll have to. The trail leads straight to him." I looked back at my house, light glowing through the curtains. He was inside, pacing, humming that same tune. The same man who tucked Nora into bed. The same man who might not even be Michael. The next morning, Paula met me in her office. Stacks of files rose like walls around her desk. She slid a paper across the wood. 2 million transferred to the Cayman account. Time-stamped. Traceable. This is our break. I stared at the numbers, heart racing. Each zero looked like a nail, sealing the coffin of lies. That's enough. Paula nodded firm. Enough for the real authorities. We hand this over tonight. By afternoon, the snow had turned to slush. The city streets glistened with dirty water. I followed him at a distance, breath fogging against the windshield. He parked outside the office building, slipped inside quickly. Phone glued to his ear, voice clipped, angry. Cheryl's car idled 2 blocks away, her silhouette still as stone behind the wheel. She raised her phone, signaling. This was it. When dusk fell, blue lights cut through the gray streets. Sirens wailed sharp, bouncing off brick walls. I pressed my hands to the steering wheel, knuckles white. Officers stormed his office. Their boots pounded up the stairs. Neighbors gathered outside, scarves pulled tight against the cold. I watched from my car, heart hammering so hard it hurt. The door burst open. And for the first time, the stranger in my house had nowhere to run. The sirens cut through the night, sharp and merciless. Red and blue lights pulsed across the wet street outside. Through the windshield, I watched the office building glow with chaos. Doors slammed. Officers stormed inside, boots pounding on the stairwell. I gripped the steering wheel until my palms ached. Every nerve in my body waited for the sound. It came. The crack of a door forced open. Shouts. Then the sight of him, dragged into the cold. His wrists cuffed, his face pale but defiant. Michael Donovan. Officer Alvarez announced. You're under arrest for embezzlement, fraud, conspiracy." The words rang out, echoing down the street. My chest twisted. Because that wasn't Michael. That was Matthew. And no one knew. Neighbors stood on the sidewalk, scarves wrapped high, breath rising like smoke. Whispers spread fast. He stole money. After his wife's death, I heard pity shift into suspicion. He caught my eye across the flashing lights. For one moment, his gaze softened, almost pleading. As if asking me to stay silent. As if daring me to speak. Cheryl stepped close to the officers, her badge flashing under the red glow. She looked at me, a sharp nod, almost invisible. We were in this together. But it had to stay quiet. For now. I climbed from the car, boots sinking into slush. The cold bit through my stockings, sharp as glass. A reporter's camera flashed. Light burst across my face. "Mrs. Donovan, any words about your husband's arrest?" My mouth opened, but no sound came. The stew smell still clung to my coat. My heart pounded with the memory of that birth certificate. 2 names. 2 lives. 1 coffin. Inside, I carried the weight of knowing the truth. Outside, I had to play the grieving widow. The lies tasted bitter, but silence was survival. Later, at the station, I sat on a hard wooden bench. The air smelled of wet paper and disinfectant. Through the window, snow drifted down slow, like falling ash. I heard his voice echo down the hall. Low. Angry. "Lawyer. I want my lawyer." The clink of chains followed. Cheryl appeared, expression calm but eyes fierce. "They'll press him tonight. But tomorrow, Claire, tomorrow we bring the documents." She laid a hand on the folder in my lap. The papers crinkled under her touch. I nodded, though my throat felt raw. I thought of Nora asleep in her bed, believing her father was gone. Believing her world was safe. But I knew better. The truth was about to surface. Not in whispers. Not in shadows. In a courtroom, under lights, before everyone who ever doubted me. The question pressed sharp against my chest. When he stands before the judge, will I finally see the man behind the mask? The courtroom smelled faintly of old paper and polished wood. I sat at the front, hands folded tight in my lap. Nora wasn't here. I couldn't let her see this. Matthew, still called Michael by everyone, stood at the defense table. Cuffs gleamed against his wrists. He looked thinner, eyes shadowed, but his smile was steady, as if he believed he could charm his way out. The judge entered. Gavel struck, sharp as a gunshot. "I'll rise." The room obeyed. Paula stepped forward first. She placed a stack of bank records on the table. Her voice was steady, clipped. "Your Honor, these transfers total more than $2 million, all under the alias Matthew Keene." The defense lawyer scoffed. "Clerical errors. My client has no twin." "This is nonsense." Cheryl's heels clicked against the floor. She carried the yellowed birth certificate, plastic sleeve protecting its fragile edges. Her voice cut through the courtroom. "Michael Donovan and Matthew Donovan. Twin brothers, born the same day in Rockford, Illinois." A murmur rippled through the benches. I saw heads tilt, eyes widen. For the first time, Matthew's smile faltered. The prosecutor laid the duplicate rings on the evidence table. 2 identical gold bands. One engraved M. Donovan, the other M. Davon. Even from my seat I saw his jaw clench. "Mr. Donovan," the judge said, her tone sharp, "can you explain why there are 2 birth certificates, 2 passports, and 2 wedding bands?" He opened his mouth. No sound came. Only silence, stretching heavy across the room. I sat frozen, nails pressing half-moons into my palms. My heart pounded so loudly I feared it would echo in the wood-paneled walls. This was the moment. The lie collapsing in front of strangers. The judge leaned forward, her glasses catching the light. "This court finds sufficient cause to proceed. Mr. Donovan, whoever you truly are, You will be remanded. The gavel struck again. Definitive. Unforgiving. Matthew turned toward me, eyes burning with a mixture of rage and despair. His lips formed silent words. I couldn't hear them, but I read them clearly. You did this. I lowered my gaze. Because he was right. For once, silence had not erased me. Silence had become my weapon. Outside the courthouse, the winter air cut like glass. Reporters shouted questions. Microphones flashed inches from my face. I said nothing. I pulled my coat tighter, folder pressed close to my ribs. Justice had begun. But justice always came with a price. And I knew mine was still waiting. Because soon I would face the hardest truth of all. Nora believed her father was gone. But the man she loved still lived. Wearing another name. Would you tell your daughter the truth? Or let her keep believing the lie? Comment 1 for truth, 2 for silence. 6 months passed. Winter's grip loosened, leaving Madison draped in soft slush and early buds. I walked along Lake Monona one morning, coat unbuttoned, air sharp but filled with promise. The water shimmered under pale sun. Birds darted low, their wings cutting the surface like knives. I closed my eyes, breathing in the cold sweetness. For the first time in months, my chest didn't feel like stone. Back at the house, the cedar deck smelled of thawing wood. I brushed away brittle leaves, their edges snapping under my hands. For years this place had felt like a prison. Now it was something else. Mine. Inside, Nora was curled on the couch, laptop open, hair falling over her face. College essays. She muttered when I walked in. Her voice carried both excitement and fatigue. I poured 2 mugs of tea, steam rising, scent of chamomile softening the air. We sat side by side. She read a paragraph aloud about wanting to study journalism. Her voice shook, but her eyes glowed. I want to tell stories that matter, she said. I reached for her hand. That's brave, Nora. Your words will carry further than you think. She smiled, the kind that reminded me of the little girl on the linoleum floor, playing with cups. Later that week, I attended a support group downtown. A circle of women sat in folding chairs, coats piled by the radiator. The room smelled faintly of burnt coffee and lavender hand lotion. One woman whispered, "My husband left me for someone younger. I feel invisible." Another dabbed her eyes, murmuring, 30 years of marriage, gone overnight. I listened, heart aching, realizing I wasn't alone. When my turn came, I hesitated. The metal chair was cold beneath me. "My name is Claire," I said softly. "My husband, well, I thought I knew him. Turns out I didn't. No details." "Not yet." But the women nodded, their faces etched with the same quiet pain I carried. One reached across the circle, fingers brushing mine. "We're here," she whispered. Driving home that night, the city lights blurred through my windshield. For months, I'd been hiding in shadows, protecting Nora with silence. But maybe silence wasn't only a weapon. Maybe it could also be a shield, a way to guard her heart while I built something new. At home, the oven ticked as a pie cooled on the counter. Apple and cinnamon filled the kitchen, warm and sweet. Nora came down in fuzzy socks, hair tied back. "Smells amazing, Mom," she said, sliding onto a stool. I sliced us 2 pieces, the crust flaking under the knife. We ate quietly, the only sound the scrape of forks and the faint hum of the fridge. For once, the silence didn't feel like erasure. It felt like peace, but deep inside, a voice whispered, "This isn't finished. Justice may have been served in court, but legacy, our legacy, was still waiting to be reclaimed." I glanced at Nora, her eyes bright over her slice of pie. She was becoming her own woman, and I had a choice: bury the truth forever, or shape it into something she could inherit. The decision pressed against my chest, steady, urgent, impossible to ignore. Spring bloomed bright over Madison. Tulips lined the sidewalks, their colors startling after months of gray. The lake shimmered under sunlight, and children's laughter carried across the breeze. A year had passed since that night. The night the police told me Michael was dead. The night I realized the man in my bed was not my husband. Now I sat in a folding chair at Nora's high school auditorium. The air smelled faintly of floor polish and carnations. Parents fanned themselves with folded programs, whispering. On stage, Nora stood tall in her navy gown. Cap tassel swayed as she adjusted the microphone. Her voice rang clear, steady. She spoke about truth, resilience, and finding strength in silence. I felt my throat close. Those were my words, reshaped into hers. She was becoming everything I had hoped, and more. From the back row, a movement caught my eye. A woman stood quietly, hair cropped short, dark sunglasses hiding her face. Something about the tilt of her shoulders, the set of her mouth. Recognition struck like lightning. Bethany. Not Jenny anymore. But still the woman who once shared my home, my bed, my life. For a heartbeat, our eyes met across the crowded room. No words. No anger. Only a silence filled with everything we had lost. I didn't move. I didn't point her out. Because this moment belonged to Nora. Not to betrayal. Not to secrets. Nora's speech ended. The room erupted in applause, chairs scraping the floor. She smiled, cheeks flushed pink, and I clapped until my palms stung. When she crossed the stage to accept her diploma, pride rose in me like sunlight after rain. I looked back again. The woman in the sunglasses was gone. Only an empty space remained. But I knew she had seen our daughter shine. That had been enough for her. Later at home, Nora placed the diploma on the mantel beside the old wedding photo. She touched the frame gently, dust rising in the golden light. She'd be proud. Wouldn't she, Mom? She whispered. I wrapped an arm around her shoulders. She would be proud. And so am I. The house smelled of fresh apple pie cooling on the counter. The furnace hummed softly, no longer a menace, only warmth. For the first time in years, I felt peace settle into my bones. Michael was gone. Matthew was unmasked. Jenny, Bethany, lived in shadows. But Nora stood tall in the light. That was my victory. Not revenge, not rage, but legacy. A future built on truth, even if the whole truth stayed buried. I sat on the porch at dusk, notebook on my lap. Fireflies blinked over the yard. The air smelled of cut grass, damp earth. I wrote the final words. I survived. I chose silence. I chose her. And maybe, just maybe, that was the truest form of justice. What about you? If you had to choose between truth and protection, which path would you take? Share your thoughts below. Your story might help another woman heal. You are not alone.